questions and all that are welcome. I'm looking at them as we go here, see them coming along. I've been live streaming on the web every weekday, usually starting at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. This Friday's Mayday special will start an hour later. You can find all of these broadcasts and other pandemic-related podcasts, songs, and other materials at davidrovics.com/quarantine, including my new live album, Viral Solidarity, which you can find on all the music streaming platforms. You can also find the podcasts on Spotify, Apple, Google, etc. if you search on any of those podcasting platforms for This Week with David Rovics. As of this week, Discussions with David is being live streamed on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Food Not Bombs Global, and the Song News Network, among other places such as my YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch accounts. And maybe somebody could comment from any of those platforms and tell me that, no, it's working. I can see it's working. Excellent. Eventually, if I keep this daily live stream regimen going, I will start interviewing people I have never met, like real journalists do. But as a traveling musician with a political bent, singing at a lot of protests, I meet a lot of people, and I've always wanted to interview a lot of the folks I know to introduce them to other people in case people don't know who they are already. Today's interview is no exception to this rule. I don't remember when I first met Lisa Fithian, but I think it was approximately 20 years ago. There are probably many occasions in the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s when I marched in protests Lisa was involved with organizing, but I didn't know that then. Lisa has never been one of the people who is typically giving the speeches in front of the microphone at big rallies. But if a lot of people were involved with a well-organized civil disobedience action of some kind, quite likely Lisa was one of the people organizing and choreographing it. Lisa's strengths as an organizer go way beyond protesting and shutting down meetings of the global corporate elite, however. Among organizers, she's known especially for her communication skills and strategic thinking as a community builder with a deep understanding of the principles of horizontal organizing. I'm not going to try to give you even a partial list of Lisa's accomplishments because the point here is to talk to Lisa rather than have her sit there while I tell you about her. But I would just say that the skills that Lisa has to share with us are more needed now than ever, and the precipice we are on is a tipping point where things can go in various directions. I'm pretty sure Lisa might have some ideas for how we might seize upon this moment to end up with a better world after all these waves of so many forms of death and suffering have abated. Lisa, welcome to my little live stream show.
Thank you so much, David. It's pretty exciting.
I agree. I always wanted to do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was realizing it's been, I think, about 5 years since we've seen each other. And you were in Austin, Texas at that time, and you were just about to start working on this book that you finished last year, and you kind of sort of probably did a lot of self-isolating during that period that you were writing the book. And I just this is a very vague, open-ended question, but what has been the past couple months like for you as a recently published author, probably about to do all kinds of book tours, which all got canceled? A very familiar scenario for me, but I want to hear about your experience.
Yeah. Well, it actually came out in September of last year, and I thought I'd do this book in a year. I started it in 2012, thinking that I'd get it done fast, but it took 7 years. And I was able to do a lot of events over the fall, both book events and trainings. And I was particularly focused on getting to a lot of the new folks in Extinction Rebellion, because, Extinction Rebellion. And I started doing these escalating resistance mass rebellion trainings, because this book, Shut It Down, Stories from a Fierce Loving Resistance, part of it, I'm sharing the lessons of 40 years. And a lot of that is that we have to create crisis and social disruption to bring about fundamental change. So I was doing these events and had a whole bunch lined up that have now been canceled. But part of my whole shtick was like, we need to get out in large numbers and shut things down, like we saw in Tahrir Square in Hong Kong. And now it's sort of like, no, that's not what we're going to be able to do. So it's required some creative thinking on my part, but but I think that, part of it for me is like still conveying the lessons, getting people to think, getting people to start preparing now for the times when we can come back out and rise up. Because, with the climate catastrophe, with the rise of fascism, with this moment of capitalism on the edge, we've got to be prepared to keep tipping things in our favor.
Right.
And so that's part of that. Now is a great time to keep getting prepared for when we can do the things of mass shutdowns.
Sort of, I mean, not necessarily that we have momentum necessarily, but to hold on to the momentum is the idea. And who knows, maybe we do. I mean, looking around on the internet, at least, which is a weird way to try to get a pulse of what's happening because of the domination of the internet by a few corporations that really skew the whole, what you're seeing. So but it certainly appears that there's a heck of a lot of organizing going on in various forms online, at least around this strike that you're talking about starting on May 1st, and
Right.
They're talking about popular resistance, and a lot of sort of organic local rent strike groups have formed. I mean, I've been saying that, like, it seems like this when you have like a 90-day suspension on evictions, like we have in Oregon and many other states now, it's sort of like not paying rent is sort of like a rehearsal for a rent strike, but the real rent strike will start once the ban on evictions is lifted at the end of June, unless they extend it further. It's sort of I wonder what you think about like this whole rent strike, this rent strike organizing, and how that might pan out.
I mean, I think it's fantastic. And I think, David, what I would say is that if there is a momentum that we have, it might be a momentum in our minds, a momentum of understanding that the system that we had isn't working, and that a lot of the things that we dreamed about are actually possible now. And so I feel like, it's like we now understand that the world can be different. Another world is possible. Another world is
Right.
now. And so all over the world, people are saying that the climate, with the cleaning up of the air, people are saying it is possible, that we don't have to be driving to work and using all these fossil fuels, that we shouldn't be paying these extraordinary rents, that shelter is a human right, that food is a human right. So I don't know, because that's always our battle as organizers. It's not just the material gains, but getting us to understand and see the world differently, because what we can imagine we can create, and so we have to imagine first in order to really manifest it. And I think right now so many more people are like opening up, like that, even that hashtag campaign, I'm not going to die for Wall Street. These things are just popping up and spreading, and it's like right on, right? So that's part of what I'm excited about.
Yeah, these ideas are really taking off and really spreading. And in Europe, the sort of global justice movement in Europe, and the sort of I don't know, the movement for a more equal egalitarian society that goes by many names at many different times, but this movement talks a lot about austerity budgets and the whole like here in the US you don't hear the word used as much, like as a way to describe government policy, but I mean, as you know, in Europe they have a lot more government assistance and government. I mean, the government is involved with people's lives. It's one of the main entities that provide housing for people in most European countries. Et cetera. Like half of the Danish workers work for the state, even though it's ostensibly a capitalist society. This kind of thing. This is very common, very normal in Europe and in these very prosperous societies. But things have been getting worse in almost all these societies over the past decades, and the budgets are getting tighter for education and all these different kinds of programs that most working class people have always appreciated and don't want to see, losing these things. Pensions, the retirement age, the number of, all kinds of different things are going in the wrong direction, and they call that austerity. And now we suddenly find, it seems, that all that austerity was completely fabricated, unnecessary, and had nothing to do with any kind of economic realities. Like now it's just suddenly the government's spending all this money. I wonder, talk about that. What does that do to our minds?
Right. Well, I mean, that just like even the IMF World Bank canceling debt for 70 nations. I mean, it's interesting because I always feel like Europe in some ways has been like 10 years behind the economic disasterism that happens, but they are ahead of us in terms of like fighting back against it. And I think part of it's because it's a many multi-party governmental systems, but also you have labor unions there that
Yeah.
are willing to fight in many ways. And you have that long history of resistance from the proletariat on up through the union, right? So it's a different playing field in Europe.
Yeah.
And yes, they embrace the word austerity, but the other word that came out of there that I've always loved is precarity, understanding how precarious the vast majority of people are. And
Yeah.
so both of those words, they have been paying attention to how these global institutions like the IMF and World Bank have been putting a lot of nations in the global south into these precarious situations, and austerity and the whole role of neoliberalism in like creating this illusion about these things for the social good, but really they're just for the capitalist good. And so, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen and whether what I do know is that there is a lot of organizing in this country right now, around the economic systems. You've seen workers rising up, walkouts, strikes have been growing in the US from the teacher strike. So we're seeing more strike resistance, which is one of the most powerful vehicles of non-cooperation.
Yeah.
But I'm still not seeing as many of the actual official unions coming out and backing those, right? And in fact, you can see that there's some that are trying to tamp it down come Mayday. So until like the unions really are willing to step into resistance, and until like the white liberal progressive centrists are willing to actually come in real solidarity with the working people and the communities on the margin, I don't know that we're going to get where we need to get in this country. Like, I mean, maybe the bottom will drop out on its own for these capitalists. And then they're going to try and reclaim it and co-opt what we're doing. But, again, I always say it's up to our organizing right now, and how much can we move the unions and the progressives to really into the fight right now. So that's a lot of our work. Yeah.
When you mentioned the situation with the unions in the United States and how different that is from so many other countries, and we both have had a lot of experience with a lot of social movements on both sides of the Atlantic, and when I used to see around a lot more, like 15, 20 years ago at a lot of different protests that you were organizing and I was singing at, both in North America and Europe, and at the time, what I was so struck by was the power of the social movement that we were both part of, in the sense that, for one thing, to say, aside, everything else aside, having spent as much time as I already had spent touring in both North America and Europe, what really struck me was that, once this movement came around, it was like the social scene was so similar on both sides of the Atlantic, and the sorts of the methods of organizing, the popularity of these horizontal organizing methods, and the sort of way that these methods of organizing were being replicated, and also just the sort of the milieu you'd be in a different country, and you have to like kind of take a moment to remember what country are you in, because because everything that was happening was so similar. And then once that movement started really declining by around 2005 or so, it really started changing, and then it was very stark difference between organizing in the United States as opposed to organizing in Europe, because it seemed to me that in Europe, you had all these institutions that people could sort of fall back on when that movement wasn't happening, like unions and left-wing political parties that are in power sometimes. A totally different sort of situation. But what really struck me was how similar it was during the time when the movement was really at its peak. Did you make similar observations, or were you more like noticing the differences at the time?
Well, I think I really. I had not done a lot of work in Europe or in other places around the world prior to the early 2000s. And so I don't have the history before that. But what it felt like to me was that there were differences, in the sense that in Europe and other places around the world, you had people actually engaging in political discourse at a level that we don't often deal with here. And my sense about the US is that we were very practically oriented. It was all about the logistics and the how-to, which is in some ways, in hindsight, is very much sort of endemic of like white supremacy culture. It's very transactional, and we're about business and getting it all done. And we were developing a model that was really holistic and really important in terms of supporting that movement, the global justice movement. So when I first was in Prague for the IMF World Bank meeting in 2000, I felt like the European movement was learning from what we were doing in the US, what we did at the WTO, and was trying to adopt similar strategies around convergence spaces, the affinity groups, spokes councils, the consensus process. And I remember sitting in that huge convergence space, and we were coming up with what would the hand signals we would use that could transcend the differences in our language where people didn't speak English. And I remember also that there was no training. There was no direct action training that was happening there. And I volunteered to do some trainings, which was wild because it was like being translated into 7 different languages. And then later on, years later, when I went back, particularly in 2008, when you and I were running together in Germany around the G8 summit there, there was a number of new trainers collectives. And some of them were like, hey, we got trained by you in 2000, and we started doing these trainers collectives.
Nice.
Now, this is not new to Europe because the anti-nuclear movement had been doing organizing like this for a long time in Europe. So again, it's not new, but it's like what's present in the culture in that moment. And so I felt like the global justice movement was doing this great building of like the strengths of both sides of the pond, you might say, in terms of its uprising. And then, you know, we have to remember in the US, as we were coming into our power, it's when, you know, I often say that militarism is the belly of the beast, and militarism is the place where the state can control the narrative around patriotism. But we were going after the heart of the beast, which was capitalism, and we were changing the narrative, and we were on the offense, and they were on the defense, and we were winning. And it was in that time, off of like 9/11, though, which sort of transitioned us into this global war on terror, where George Bush then launched these wars in Afghanistan, but even more so in Iraq in 2003, right? And you know, we also saw like the Patriot Act. We saw that the state was actually setting itself up to create a level of fear and a set of new laws to clamp down on that global justice movement and turn it back to the anti-war movement. And that's what we saw. We had to pivot in this country. And when we pivoted, we lost a lot of ground, you know? And so, and Europe wasn't dealing with that in the same way that we were in the US and the fear that was emerging. So, you know, and again, if you look at what happened in the US, we continued. And part of what happened, if you look at the global justice movement, by 2005, that's when we threw down in New Orleans around Katrina. And instead of like, you know, as I often talk about how we were building all this infrastructure to support that movement, from the legal collectives and the food collectives and the media collectives and the medic collectives, we threw down in New Orleans and we stayed. And we built a parallel society to help the people of New Orleans come back. Anyway, so it's like, you know, and then that movement's really transformed into the climate movement. So it's like, we have to always look at the history and the roots of where we are today from where we came from.
Yeah, and how these things get passed on, and what's happening at the time that then influences what's going to happen. One thing that always struck me about being part of every social movement anywhere that I've ever been part of anything is there are always a lot of people who think that the strategies that they're now sort of engaging in were just invented. Right. I mean, I'm not saying anything. I'm not meaning to dismiss or say anything insulting about people that assume that they just invented something, because why should they think any differently if they don't know, you know, that they didn't? But that's a fascinating phenomenon.
David, I think that's actually is really important, because I always say that there's no original idea, that all these things do come on. There's a limited number of tactics, like there's a limited number of strategies even. But, you know, the truth is each generation does evolve at some. And that while there may be a limited number of tactics, the 198 of Gene Sharp, it's like, what's happening in the political moment? How do you frame them? What's the flavor? What's the color? Like, it's like, so I don't know, things are the same and things do change and things emerge. And that's where we have to just sort of also honor the new generations that come in, and not, you know, that's why I always like to say, somebody that's been in this a long time, it's very easy to think, all right, been there, done that, you know, whatever. But we have to actually hold that the young ones coming in are going to see things differently and might evolve it in a way that might be more effective than what we did. So Anyway, I just wanted
Yeah.
to throw that in.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And I there's so many different places to go here, but you were and then I had a brilliant thought that was like really related to that last thing you said, and then it just escaped out of my mind. But the book, can you tell me about what's some of the plans for this Mayday Strike 2020? That what's behind you that we're all looking at there? I
Yeah,
love that
maybe.
hashtag Mayday 2020. What's going on with all that?
Well, what's that Victor Hara quote that nothing can withstand the force of an idea whose time has come?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in all of us that are organizers, trying to figure out how to have our agency, where do we have leverage, what's meaningful. Mayday was on the horizon.
Yeah.
And I am not a woman that has historically supported this idea of general strikes because I don't think they're really viable. But this year I was like, general strike.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people were thinking that. And so what we are now seeing is that there are many organizing spaces, many different formations. But the call that I initially really responded to was a call that came out of Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi that put out this call and a set of demands for this Friday, May Day. Then you saw there's a huge, a very large tent formation called the People's Bailout, which had also come together looking at a set of demands around, protecting human rights in this period. And so those were two like major organizing formations putting out calls for May Day. You had a group called the Corona Strike, which were folks coming out of Occupy, which were moving more of a social media campaign. You have a group called Gen Strike 2020 that has a website up. But the truth is like now that these organizing initiatives have happened and gotten out, you see groups all across the country sort of taking on May Day. There's a virtual rallies. Jane Fonda's doing a virtual rally for Fire Door Fridays. Haymarket Books has got stuff. Climate Shutdown in DC has got virtual rallies. I mean, every day I'm getting more stuff across my email about organizing people are doing. And so I feel like it's out of the box. And, I imagine we're going to get some media coverage. There are car caravans being organized, virtual rallies, car caravans. But one of the main things that we're seeing is that these workers who have been doing these walkouts, and there's a strike tracker on a website called Payday. Yeah, Payday Report.
Oh,
and
great.
They've got a worker strike tracker. Because you've had meat packing workers walking out, Instagram workers, Amazon workers, Whole Food workers, Target workers. A lot of those workers are going out on strikes or doing sick outs on Friday. So I feel like it's out of the box. And the thing that I'm most excited about, David, is that, strikes are about having economic impact. And I don't know to what degree we're going to have massive economic impact on Friday. I was hoping that the ILWU would be able to shut the ports down. It sounds like they're doing rallies more than shutdowns. But what I felt was most important is that it's a time where people are organizing collectively. And like I've been on these people strike calls, and there have been some of these calls, have been 150 people from like all over the country. So for me, the important thing was like getting people working together to take collective action and seeing themselves as part of something greater. And at least the payday strike people, just like the rent strike people, are now looking at this is just the beginning. And that the first of the month from here on out are going to be days of collective action, whether you're not paying your rent, whether you're walking out, whether you're doing some virtual action. And so I feel like this is the launch of something that we have no idea what it's going to become, but let's keep feeding it. Let's feed it, because the more of us that do it, because what I do know about power, because this is ultimately all about power and exercising our power, reclaiming our power. The more of us on the move, the more people that want to come in, right? Because if they see there's momentum, they see there's something happen, they're like, I want to be a part of that. And so, and one of the things that some of the demands, it's not only don't pay your rent, don't go to work, but it's don't shop, right? No shopping that day. Or take a virtual action, put a sign out your window. Go put signs on your billboards, don't pay the rent, no shopping, no working, no rent pay. And so every single one of you, whether you're, sheltering in place by yourself or in a community, like put a sign out your window, take some chalk, go chalk the sidewalk, like do noise protests, So I think it's an opportunity to organize, whether you're with group or alone. It's a bunch of us doing the same thing on one day or doing multiple things. Yeah.
I know that like there's great importance to organizations and being well organized, but I wonder about like just the power of ideas also. It seems like has a tremendous influence when memes just spread like that. I wonder, talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the errors of the power of memes, that these virtual things, whether it's like images on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, can take off, if you
Hmm.
get that right messaging. And there's power to that. I mean, excuse me, we know that out of the Occupy movement, one of the most effective things that came out of the Occupy was the framing of the 1% and the 99%.
It really stuck, huh?
It stuck, it changed the national narrative, and it had
It did.
changed the analysis. So I don't know how we're going to evolve and what will continue to emerge, but there's a lot of brilliant creative minds and people putting stuff out. So that is very powerful. The other thing I wanted to talk about, David, is that, which I think is also related to this, and you talked a lot about horizontal organizing earlier, which is, again, one of the things that I care a lot about, because, again, I care a lot about power. And so much of the organizations that we have relationships with or that are driving things are hierarchical, because that's how our culture is organized, sort of the top-down model. Whereas we come out of movements, anarchist movements, that are horizontal models and, affinity groups or cells or whatever. And in this period of virtual living that we're in, I have noticed more and more how we're living in Zoom. And I've been on Zoom dinners and Zoom happy hours and Zoom dance parties and Zoom meetings and Zoom webinars. And I keep feeling like, oh, this is like my little crew right now. In fact, at 1:00 today, I have a Zoom meeting with a group of us that did work together, and we just get together once a week to just check in. And I'm like, oh, these are my people. This is my squad. This is my affinity group. And I'm also watching the spread of mutual aid. And mutual aid, another anarchist concept that has spread all over the country. It's all these circles of people coming in to do solidarity with people that are getting really screwed. And I keep thinking, we are building that horizontal network right now, and we just have to visualize it, and we have to come with intention and know that, like, when this is all over, do those mutual aid networks continue? Do these circles continue? And do we see ourselves as part of this larger web of resistance that can be preparing for those times that when we come out into the streets and we need to get at scale? Because I'm very interested in getting to a scale beyond anything we've done before, because I think that's what we need.
Yeah.
We're building that now. So let's go with intention and visualize it and be prepared to boom, when the time comes.
Yeah, I've heard the term mutual aid used more in the past few weeks than in my entire life, and then sometimes I've noticed in some of these conversations online, some people thinking like, "What is this pretentious term, mutual aid? You're just talking about interdependence," And I have never bothered mentioning that Kropotkin wrote a book called Mutual Aid like 150 years ago. So,
Right.
but it's a good. Interdependence is also a wonderful term, whether we're talking about using that one or mutual aid. But yeah, it's been really something. And I wonder about, like, in terms of like this wonderful book that you just wrote, which you have there, Shut It Down. Your way of, how did you figure, like, when you went off years ago to start trying to write this book, did you have questions about, like, do I want to write a how-to manual, or do I want to write a memoir, or something in between, or what's the best way to tell these stories and explain these concepts? It seems like telling stories is often a good way to explain concepts, which seems to be kind of what you decided to. And I must admit here that I still have not read the book. I when the pandemic hit, I was right around that time thinking of doing that, and then
That's all right. I mean, David, you are the quintessential storyteller. And that's one reason why I like your music so much, because I'm actually learning history through your music. And you're such an amazing lyricist. So it's like, yes, the power of stories. And I have had a lot of stories. Actually, that was one of the challenges in the books. I had too many stories. And I was like, what stories am I going to tell? But the truth is, it started out more as a manual because, around the time of Occupy, I had been doing, and this is one of the stories in the book, I had been working with this project, which was a place where labor unions, community-based organizations, grassroots organizations, and direct actionists were coming together around sort of after the banking bailout and the collapse of the 2008 financial crisis. And we were doing these weeks of actions where we were organizing people to do daily actions to create a crisis. And in May 2011, we did one in New York City, going against the budget cuts and trying to expose the banks for bankrupting cities by taking so many fees, which is what we're seeing in this bailout right now. The banks made $10 billion.
They made $10 billion off of the first wave of bailout. Yeah,
exactly, which is freaking insane, right?
Insane.
So it's like, so there was this sort of week of rage, you might call, has been a model of organizing I've been doing since the Justice for Janitors days. And so I was like, I want to, because I have there's a lot of people doing organizing and direct action, but I had been finding a way of doing this work that would allow different sectors to come together, could throw down, have big impact, and win or prevent damage. So I was like, I wanted to share some of that. So I did a manual called Kicking Corporate Booty, which was the manual on how to, which then led to this initiative where we did shutdowns in about 10 cities around the time Occupy came out. So that was the original thing. It was going to be a manual. But I was like, you had to have stories. But then I also knew, and one of the reasons it took me 7 years, because you were like, take a break. I couldn't stop organizing. And so I kept organizing over those years, which made it really hard for me to get the book, because I'm not really a writer. I'm an organizer. I'm a street girl. But the organizing kept informing the writing. And, whether it was like in Ferguson or Standing Rock, those became stories in the book that were not there originally. And again, helped me take some of the pieces I was grappling with and show how they come to life. And some of those other pieces, and it actually happened after I came back from Standing Rock. I wanted to start a new trainers initiative because I was like, there are some foundational pieces that we need for transformative organizing for our movements. And one of those is dealing with racism and white supremacy as a core piece of our organizing. And I just looked at every movement I'd been in and watched racism tear it apart. And so I also made a decision when I was in Austin writing the book to take on, I was like, I'm going to stop doing issue organizing. I want to organize on racism and see what happens. And in 2012, 2013, as I was in the beginnings of this book, I helped found a group called Undoing Racism Austin that continues to this day and has led to another group I work with called Undoing White Supremacy Austin. Anyway, if we, particularly those of us as white organizers, don't bring an anti-racist analysis and practice into our movement work, we're going to continue to fail.
Can you talk a little about that? In what ways have you seen organizations or networks fail and fall apart because of internal racism? I wonder if you could just...
Occupy would be an example. It was at least in New York City, when you're working in urban centers on these popular uprisings, it's going to be a multiracial space. But white folks who often have the privilege and the resources and have been sickened by white supremacy, so we tend to take charge. We tend to be in control. We tend to think that we know the right way to do things and the best way to do things. We don't know. We tend to center ourselves. And when you do that, you marginalize and invalidate and invisibilize people of color's lived experience. And then we don't listen. And so that has been problematic in every movement throughout history, from the feminist movement to the housing movements to, poor people organizing movements, you name it, anti-war movements, we have environmental movements. You've always seen a segregation and people of color feeling like they have to organize in their own space because white folks are too dangerous to work with, quite frankly. It's too painful. So, and there's no real solidarity or trust that can be built when white people haven't done that work, because the thing about us is that we don't have to deal with racism if we don't want to, because we don't think it affects us. But when you start to do this work, you understand that we have been affected by it, that we've given up a part of our humanity, that we've been made sick by these how white culture works through us. And so when we start to do that work ourselves, we can begin to unpack how we've been screwed up and then the harm we do from that unconsciousness that we have about our own damage. So I just keep learning, and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond have been my primary mentors. And one of the ways we dealt with this in Austin is that we brought them to train our community and our nonprofits and community leaders and our politicians now. And so what has happened is that there are a lot more groups organizing and a lot more solidarity. And even if we don't all like each other or get along, we know how to show up for one another when it really matters. And that's what's happening right now in Austin.
And showing up for each other. That I was going to say that's that concept. When you mentioned that, just that seems so important, because like in terms of the whole question of racism within so many social movements, like I've heard so many white people say, well, people of color just don't join our group, and and like I just, that. So then the question is, well, but are you joining their group? Are you going out to support activities that are going on that are led by people of color in your city or your town?
Right. Yeah, that our group, you can just stop right there. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because it's that ownership, because even just living in this culture, again, it's like everything's about ownership, and ours versus theirs. It's this dichotomy. And that's really endemic in the environmental and climate movements. And it's changing some, but, I'm doing a lot of work with Extinction Rebellion, and, it really emerged out of the UK, and they came up with a set of demands which had nothing to do with justice. And so here in the US, we did adopt a fourth demand on climate justice, but it's become hugely controversial because people believe that it's too controversial. And it's a lack of understanding, knowing our history and our understanding that people of color have been on the front line against environmental degradation, against pollution, and around the climate, saving the earth, the water, the air for generations. And in fact, hold a piece of wisdom about that we white folks don't have. And unless we are really figuring out how to be in right relationship and working together and in solidarity, we're missing a huge piece. And that's playing out again right now. It's live as we speak in the US.
Yeah. And the way the growth of the death, the number of people dying, and how the numbers are just keep on rising, and they're talking about talking about opening up places where there's no testing going on, and it's yeah, it feels like I mean, I'm sure if I worked in a hospital, it would, or if I were, working in a meatpacking plant or in a prison, it would feel like a very fast-moving disaster. But from quarantine, it feels like a very slow-moving disaster. And I go outside and there's nobody in the streets, and I'm putting up flyers, and there's just you hardly ever see anybody unless they're living on the streets.
Right. David, COVID, this virus is another really live example in this moment of this history and legacy and current reality of racism, because at the very beginning of it, there was this myth about how Black people couldn't get the virus, right? And where was that even coming from? And why
was that myth coming? There was, I heard a myth that it was a virus that only Chinese people could get. That was another myth that was going around at the beginning.
Yeah, another racist shit another racist stuff put out by this administration, the Chinese virus, right? There's all this stuff that got put out to just continue hate. But yeah, no, that was definitely a thing. Black people can't get it, which is not true. And then what does that communicate? Because we have to understand, people, unless they're political, they're listening to the mainstream media, they're listening to 45, and people may believe what they may think that what this guy and what is being said is true. And we know that it's not. And it's, that whole thing in my mind is just like another genocidal front, quite frankly. And then when it became clear that there was disproportionate impact on Black communities in terms of who is getting sick and dying, then the whole thing became a crowd. Well, it's just health things. And it's like, again, it's sort of like this narrative around, it's kind of not, I won't say it's their fault, but there's the conditions there. And there's nobody talking about racism and why those conditions were even created in the legacy. Right. Why are there health disparities in this country for the African-American community? It's because of racism, And so again, it's like never getting clear about what's actually going on. And so I feel like it's up to all of us that understand these dynamics of power and racism to keep making it visible, because, and bringing, sanity to this stuff. I mean, even Trump talking about Lysol, drinking Lysol. I mean, I keep hoping that people will figure out how insane and damaging and dangerous he is. But then you find out that the poison centers are getting calls because people are actually doing it. I mean, I don't know, we are living in insane times. And that is actually one of the things I said on my book tour a lot. I kept asking people for the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And part of what I want people to think about is that our movements have been doing some of the same things over and over again, we actually have to start getting really different right now and doing things differently. And also waking up to see that what we've been fighting for years are actually happening. So it is all possible. So what do we need to do different to keep this, protect what we've already won, and push it even further?
Yeah. I mean, like when you were talking about when we're talking about all these wildcat strikes that are going on, so few of them have seem to have much backing of the major unions. It's yeah. If they had that kind of yeah, it's.
Well, I've always felt that unions were one of the most important vehicles for redistributing wealth, and in one level, they are. Right. But the truth is they are an arm of the Democratic Party, and they take their lead from the Democratic Party. And that was the other thing I often said on this book tour. I'm going to do a little mini book tour. It's like, the way things are, we're probably going to have Trump again because incumbents typically win. The election process is flawed, both the election and the suppression. And the Democrats are perfectly capable of losing on their own. And given those conditions, we're going to see Trump again. But now we're in a position where this virus may become the justification for actually putting the election off. And the Democrats will probably go along with that. And so, again, we have to understand if we want to be radically different, if these labor unions really want to deliver for their members, they have to break from the status quo. And
but the thing is, like, they never do. And I mean, so far, but they might, and they do in other countries, but they never do here. Right. And if they're going to do it at any time, like this would be such the obvious time to realize. But what strikes me so much about the fact that the labor unions are so pathetic in this country is that you have Republican politicians, like I don't know who he is, like if he's acting Surgeon General or if he was an appointee or if he's just risen through the ranks or whatever, whoever this guy is. I can't remember his name, but it was one of the officials of the administration, whether a career bureaucrat or not, I'm not sure, but he was talking about the endemic problems of racism in the society and how it is resulting in a much higher death rate among so many people of color. And I mean, he was talking like a radical. Actually, it was like I was shocked at what I was hearing, but he was also talking like a medical professional. Like obviously, anybody who's knowledgeable about, as so many of us have become in the past few weeks, about epidemiology, understands that public health and racism are completely intertwined, and that you can't disentangle these things. But the way that they're talking about it is the kind of stuff that I just. I would expect to hear from somebody like you or, any number of other people, but not from a Republican, but of course, neither would I have expected to have just received a check from my family for $3,000 from signed by Donald Trump, so, I mean, there's a lot of things happening that are new, but.
Right. And crazy. And I don't know, I need to go back, but there was a day, and it's funny how these things come through and then they sort of disappear. A couple of days ago, I saw this thing, how there were Democratic legislators, I think it was in Vegas, Nevada, that were actually advocating for an end of all collective bargaining agreements for the workers. Like, how dare a Democrat get rid of the collective bargaining agreements for the workers? But then I thought to myself, this might be great for us because those collective bargaining agreements prevent a lot of workers from striking. So if they're taken off, then all the workers could strike. They'd be striking to get their agreements back. But
right.
But yeah, so it is a crazy time.
Which is really that's why there's been so many teachers' strikes around the country over the past few years, right? Is because of the removal of collective bargaining agreements in Wisconsin, West Virginia, and other Oklahoma. Yeah.
Love those teachers. Yep.
Yeah. And now the supermarket workers and delivery drivers are all being praised as essential workers while they're being paid $10 an hour or whatever they're getting. Yeah,
right.
It's
Well, I mean, hopefully people start questioning that more and more. I've been working with a little group that was doing some work around trying to get Trump impeached, where we were hoping people would rise up, and they didn't, which we didn't really understand. But, we've been talking a lot and trying to provoke people with a series of questions about, like, what is essential and what is of value and who determines your worth. And I think it is a good time for starting to question some of these things. I mean, we need people to start thinking at a whole different level. And I'm hoping all these workers who now are being labeled essential and are getting paid terribly and being put in dangerous conditions are starting to understand that it's not just about getting protective equipment. It's about realizing that their lives aren't for profit, right? They're not commodities. And hopefully they will reclaim and exercise their power even more,
I know that, people are constantly using the term unprecedented to describe the current moment, but actually, I mean, there's nothing is entirely unprecedented, or everything is entirely unprecedented. But there's it's in between somewhere, really, in terms of there's always some kind of precedent, and I'm often reminded of the way, like you were talking earlier, you hinted at, maybe even talked about it for a minute, but I wonder, like, a little more on the subject of, like, how a crisis can be taken advantage of by the state, or can be taken advantage of by social movements. I mean, you talk about creating crises, but then crises get created from outside, and then people respond to them, and that seems to be, clearly one of those moments we're in now, like the Great Depression, or like I'm really reminded of the 1840s. Like, I mean, in 1846, the crop failure that occurred all over Europe, that resulted in famine, partly, was partially why there was a famine in Ireland, which was also very political. But there was hunger all over Europe, and massive poverty, and all of industry shut down throughout Europe because of the conditions of because the food had become so expensive that everybody was spending all their money on food, if they had any, and they weren't buying anything else. And so industry completely shut down. And then there was massive unemployment, which then led to more poverty. And ultimately it led to every monarchy in Europe being overthrown by thousands and thousands of pitchfork wielding crowds, except for Russia and England. They didn't get overthrown. But then, and they all came back to power, and things changed in a big way in all over Europe, in terms of, like, this is where European democracy basically came from, right? Those rebellions of the 1840s. But, like, I mean, they talk about the Great Depression a lot, because that's what people remember, is the last time there was there's a depression like this. But I think the historical comparison of the 1840s is, I mean, we'll see what's going to happen. But in terms of the conditions, like 1846, the crop failure that caused this massive problem all over Europe. I mean, we're now having a crisis, which is actually, like, very similar to a crop failure in the many different ways. Actually, I mean, you could make a lot of comparisons to the pandemic that comes out of a virus, which is also the result of human encroaching on nature. And there's a lot of very similar connections between why the crop failure. I mean, that it was monocrop potatoes from South America. They only imported one variety, and that was the problem with European potato agriculture, basically. But it's I'm not trying to put you on the spot whether you know a lot about the 1840s, but it just seems like this is a moment where, this is not just an engineered shutdown of the world economies. I mean, the governments are doing this, not just out of the goodness of their hearts, because they care about a random percentage of their population, which obviously includes rich people who also die from this virus. But they're doing these shutdowns because everything would be shut down anyway. I mean, the pandemic would cause this to happen anyway. It's it's not a question. It's an observation.
Yeah, right. And I don't know a lot about the 1840s. Although a lot of us have been urging people to think about getting their shovels and pitchforks. We've been talking about that a lot. In fact, we wanted to show up on Capitol Hill with shovels and pitchforks back in January, but thought that might be a little dicey. But we do have to understand that we have to rise up, because yes, these crises, if we don't fill that space with what we want, they will take it and impose what they want. And we know that when people are hungry, right, the agrarian crisis, the famines, that is a time where people are going to rise up, because hunger is like a central thing. And if you can't get it, you're going to have to do whatever you can. And if we organize, right, so there is a moment here, and even high unemployment. So sometimes it's just like, who will spark it? Where does the spark happen? And then do people follow? And so, understanding that this is an unprecedented time in our lifetime when we're alive, but these things have happened before. And if we do go back and learn, and it's hard, like even the uprising in Egypt with the Arab Spring, you saw this amazing thing. Yes, they overthrew the dictator, but then, right, they got another repressive government. So we don't always eventually get what we want. We have to be prepared for what that clampdown is going to be. And so, but right now we are at a time where the system is pretty vulnerable. And so, again, I don't, and the thing, like we always used to say is like, because a lot of us have been wanting the state to come down for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening. It's just not happening how we might have thought. And so what, I often say is that people want to know where they're going to get their bread when the state comes down. The good thing is a lot of people are baking bread at home now, right? I'm staying in a house where somebody's baking bread every few days, right? So it's like, and that's another thing with the mutual aid. It's like learning live time that we don't have to be dependent on these other systems. We can become interdependent with what we have, and that it's also about sharing, like who's got what resources. Like that's one of the pieces that, again, I feel like I was talking about a lot of stuff in the fall, and a lot of that is happening because I was like, we have to start preparing to protect our communities, defend our neighborhoods. Like, should this rise of fascism lead to a civil war? And I was like, do you know your neighbors? Who's got the generator? Who's got extra storage for food? Like, how are you going to communicate with your neighbors? And now we have people who are like putting signs on their neighbor's door. Like we talked about this as a way to organize. If you don't know all your neighbors, you could write notes out on paper, go out early in the morning, put it on everybody's door, give them your phone number and your email, say, hey, let's connect up, right? Let's start doing things together, because that building of that relationships is going to become the basis of like our preparedness for whatever it is that we are doing next. So I don't know. I just feel like now is actually a really ripe time for us to be laying the relationship building, the network structures, the identification of needs and identification of resources. Who's got what, right? Where can we get what? Even like I was talking to folks in Chicago about, they have all these mutual aid groups in different areas. And what started to happen is like each mutual aid group was trying to meet a bunch of needs, as opposed to saying, okay, let's now network the mutual aid groups, figure out what support they need, what resources they have, how does that get shared? But over time, like we did in New Orleans, we started to break into more groups. So who are the groups doing the transportation of the stuff? Who are the groups providing the childcare? Who are the groups providing the pirate radio? So that it's like, how do we actually imagine building out a parallel society that's rooted in a different set of values and in a shared power model? Because it is happening right now. That it is happening. So how do we like keep feeding that? So I said that at the beginning of the thing, and making it visible, and then doing that collective work of redistribution of resources rooted in an analysis of who's been most impacted and harmed, and serving those communities first, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so went off on a little rant.
No, that's an excellent rant. We like rant. I'm trying to encourage rants. Lisa, just I want to close with one question randomly going back to your youth. There's many people who don't think that there was a whole lot going on in the 1980s. It has a reputation as being a decade of the me generation, as was often called on the TV, and it was like people talk about the 60s as being the time when there was so much happening, but the 80s there's nothing going on. Would you just tell us a story about one of the more exciting actions that you were involved with in the 1980s?
Mm-hmm.
Any of them?
Yeah. And I actually just want to say real quick, David, too, that
Mm.
was one of the things I found in Europe. People in Europe were like, there's nothing happening in the US. I'm like, there's so much happening in
Yeah.
the US because there has always been a lot of organizing. But the 80s saw two, at least from, again, my view of the world, two really important movements. It was the movement against the US war in Central America and the ACT UP movement against, with the rise of AIDS. And both of them were direct action movements using these horizontal structures that were working to shut things down. And for me, I was involved a lot with the pledge. Well, I did both, but the Pledge of Resistance I often talk about and I write about in the book was one of the most effective models that I'd ever been involved in because it brought everybody together in different ways and using these structures. And I mean, I don't know, right? It's like we got arrested a lot. We shut things down.
Things got shut down. That's what people don't. A lot of people involved with the global justice movement. I know that's kind of even the dated thing to talk about 20 years ago, but they didn't realize that there was even a lot of people had no idea that there were actions that actually shut stuff down in the 80s. Can you talk about one of those? I think didn't you shut down the CIA headquarters or something?
That's one of the stories in my book is when we did shut down the CIA headquarters.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was important about that movement, because even Occupy didn't pull it off. Occupy spread quickly. The pledge spread quickly. We didn't have social media at the time, but they were in hundreds of cities. But we did coordinate so that we would do collective action. So on any given day, we might shut down a ton of federal buildings. So there's a way that we can do coordinated action. But when we did the CIA, we came from all of these local groups into one big gathering in DC. And we did training thousands of people on the lawns of the Capitol. And we organized in affinity groups, doing these direct action trainings. But then we formed, I didn't have the language at the time, what I would call today flying squads. We had 3 different teams because there were 3 entrances to the CIA, the South, the West, and the North. And so we needed all the affinity groups to cluster based on size of the entrance and then fly to these entrances and shut them down. And so, we traveled out in buses. It was a early morning action. And for people that may or may not know, the CIA has been one of the primary leaders of coups across the world and counterinsurgency warfare by supplying resources, arms to right-wing militias. And that's what we were seeing in Central America. So they were a key target for what was happening in Central America and also in Africa and Angola in particular. So it was a mobilization trying to bring attention to both of those. And it was a part of a weekend mobilization where on that Monday, we'd done a big march on Saturday and a big day of trainings and an interfaith gathering. But on that Monday, some folks went to Capitol Hill to lobby. I wish they'd all come with us because it was a much better action, I thought, but diversity of tactics. But a couple thousand of us went out to CIA headquarters and we did shut it down. Lots of people, over 600 people were arrested. And again, it's like, yes, it may not have fundamentally thwarted the CIA from what they were doing, but it exposed them to a whole new level. A whole new generation of people did this massive collective action. But I think one of the most important things that we have to remember is that fear is our greatest destabilizer and disorganizer. And I've learned over these years that what we fear most is where we have to go. And the CIA is scary. Who wants to take on the CIA? And I share in the story, it's in the organizing for that, twice the lug nuts on my car were loosened. I could have died from that. I'm driving and all of a sudden this is happening and I check my car and the lug nut is, it was scary times and there were death threats during those times. And all that is always designed to keep us from organizing. And I say to people a lot, direct action is one of the most powerful and rapidly transforming strategies and ways of life. So I keep doing it. But it's sacred work because we are risking our lives when we do this. And this, the youth in Ferguson, this is not a joke, it's a game. You risk your life because the more power you organize to, the more the state is going to come down. And the way they try and stop us is through fear. And they do that by inflicting violence at some point and letting us know that they can kill us if they want to. So, this is serious stuff. And so all the more we have to go to where the fear is, because whereas my friend Starhawk says, where there's fear, there is power. And if we can take these actions and we can confront what we're most afraid of, the power that we feel from our action and our agency is even greater and it fuels us to do even more. So I guess in that sense, I would say, no matter where you are, who you are, if you're afraid of what might happen by striking or calling for a sick out, or do the actions this Friday on May Day. Take some action. Confront whatever fear you have. Take an action. Know you're not alone. We're all doing this together, and we're going to come out stronger on the other side, and then we'll figure out where we go from there.
Yeah, fantastic
Escalate.
advice.
We escalate. We keep escalating. Yeah.
Yes, escalation.
Yeah.
Lisa Fithian, thank you so much for joining me on my little show, and I hope I can have you back to discuss whatever's going to be happening over the next month or two.
Thank you so much, David. And as I said to you when I got on, I often say to people, your music keeps me in the revolution. Whenever I'm feeling down and demoralized, I just listen to your songs and I'm ready to go again. So you inspire me all the time. Yeah. Thank you
so much.
Yeah, you bet.
It's very mutual. See you again, Lisa.
Take care, David.
And thanks everybody for tuning in to this episode of Discussions with David. You can find all my discussions archived in the Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovix and in podcast form if you search for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. If you want to support my work, everything I do is entirely crowdfunded. I have no other job and no inheritance. You can go to patreon.com/davidrovix or davidrovix.com/subscribe to join my community-supported art program, especially if you're less unemployed than I am. Tomorrow's guest will be another of my favorite organizers, also one of the best public speakers I've ever heard, Ajamu Umi, currently residing in Sacramento, California, last I checked. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you again soon here in the Matrix and eventually back in the streets. Don't pay the rent.